Hello, friends. Welcome. My name is Nico Slate. On behalf of the Department of History at Carnegie Mellon University, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's lecture and to introduce Dr. Michal Friedman, who organized tonight's event and who will in turn introduce our speaker. Dr. Friedman is the Jack Bunchard Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies in the Department of History at CMU. She received her PhD in Jewish History at Columbia University in 2012. Before coming to CMU, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and at the Seminar in Advanced Jewish Studies at the Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies at the University of Oxford. Her dissertation, Recovering Jewish Spain, Politics, Historiography, and Institutionalization of the Jewish Past in Spain, 1845 to 1935, explores the significance of the Sephardic past to efforts to construct and claim a modern Spanish nation. She has published chapters in several edited volumes and articles in journals such as Jewish Quarterly Review, Jewish Social Studies, and the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies. Most recently, Dr. Friedman has established a multifaceted collaboration with the Centropa Archive, a digitalized collection of 1,200 interviews with and 20,000 photographs of Jews who remained in Eastern Europe, Russia, and the Balkans after surviving the Holocaust. Dr. Friedman, thank you so much for organizing this evening's event.
Thank you very much, Nico. And I would like to welcome Professor Natan Meir and all of you who have joined us this evening. And we would love it if you could write in the comments where you are joining us from tonight. I would also like to thank the Department of History at Carnegie Mellon and the Jewish Studies program at the University of Pittsburgh for their generous support of this event. Now, after the start of the COVID-19 epidemic, we very quickly witnessed the scapegoating of certain countries and ethnic groups as responsible for spreading the disease. And I thought it would therefore be instructive to invite someone who could speak about epidemics and Jewish history, which is my field. And soon after that, I came across an article about a little known ritual of the cholera wedding. And to my delight, it was authored by Professor Natan Meir, who I actually know from graduate school. So I immediately got in touch with him, and this is already last spring, arranged for him to give a talk to our community partner, Classrooms Without Borders. And the lecture was so fascinating that I already knew that I needed to bring him back. So my colleagues, students, and others in the community could hear him speak and would have the opportunity to learn from him. And there's indeed much to learn. Natan Meir is the Lorry Lokey Professor of Judaic Studies in the Harold Schitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies at Portland State University. He's a scholar of the social and cultural history of East European Jewry. He's the author of Kiev, Jewish Metropolis, A History, 1859 to 1914, published in 2010. And his latest book, Stepchildren of the Shtetl, which I have right here, The Destitute, Disabled, and Mad of Jewish Eastern Europe, 1800 to 1939, was just published in 2020. And he also serves as a museum consultant and leads study tours of Eastern Europe with Ayala Tours. And I'll just say that this latest book, it recovers the histories of Jewish Eastern Europe's social outcasts, and it's really a barely studied topic, which is nonetheless central to Eastern European Jewish history and really to European history. And it's interesting in the sense that it studies these individuals on the margins of an already marginalized people. So today, with no further ado, I'd like Natan will tell us more about a particular part of his book and this particular tradition of the cholera wedding. Natan, thank you.
Thank you so much, Michal. Thank you, Nico, for having me. It's great to be with you all. I'd prefer to be with you all in person, but this is how we do it. I'm going to just briefly stop the share so I can be right up here with you all and say that I'm also particularly pleased that Professor Friedman asked everyone to list where they're from, because I can see that we've got a lot of people from Pittsburgh, but then we've also got people in California and Boston and Texas and Seoul, South Korea, and Qatar, So it's pretty cool. That's the one good advantage of Zoom, is that we can all get together from all over the world. So I'm looking forward to today. I'm going to obviously talk for a bit, and then look forward to your questions. It seems
Oh,
that yeah, go ahead.
I forgot to mention.
Oh yes, that's right.
So excited to introduce Professor Meir that I forgot to mention that please, if you have questions during the talk, please send them in the chat privately to me, and then I'll be able to field them later at the end of the talk. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that what our tech people told us is that the chat will be, it's enabled now for everyone to see, and then later on it will be you'll just be able to send the questions directly to Professor Friedman. So it seems that what I was going to say is that when I give this talk, it's somehow I always get amazing questions. I think it's the subject matter is just so fascinating. It's not really anything to do with me. It's just that the material itself is, as you'll see, is really just curious in many ways, somewhat peculiar, distinctive, and I'm looking forward to your questions and the discussion that we'll have afterwards as well. Okay, so I'm hoping everyone can see my screen now, and what I want to do is I'm going to talk a lot today about this particular ritual called the cholera wedding that emerged among the Jews of Eastern Europe in the 19th century. And the cholera wedding helps us understand how this particular community, the Jewish community of Eastern Europe, which was the largest Jewish community in the world at this time, how it dealt with, how it approached, how it treated its most marginalized members. And I think that can give us a very interesting lens into understanding what we're looking at today in the 21st century during COVID-19, as Professor Friedman suggested earlier. So to start off with cholera, there were 6 cholera pandemics in the 19th century and a final 7th one in the early 20th century. And of course, even thinking about the possibility of several pandemics in a row of the same disease is pretty frightening right now, given that just the one pandemic alone is hard enough to take. But there were 7 pandemics over the course of those years, those decades. And in some ways, cholera was a very modern disease in the sense, not in the sense that it was new to the modern era, but in the fact that it was transmitted so quickly across such large territories was really thanks to modern communication advances, new advances in shipping, urbanization, and so on and so forth. Cholera is a particularly frightening disease in the sense that it attacks very quickly. And one way I describe it in my book is that it seems as if within a matter of days or even hours, one is basically one's insides become the outside, and you lose all of your liquid very, very quickly. Now, of course, we know that it's a bacterium caused by a bacterium that was spread by contaminated water and food, and was very often spread most quickly, as we understand, of course, in areas, in neighborhoods that had very poor sewage, that had no clean source of water. But at the time, for much of the 19th century, people did not understand what the cause of cholera was. So there were a number of different explanations. One of the most popular ones was that it was due to some kind of miasma, some sort of bad air that tended to appear in certain areas for all kinds of different reasons. There were various hypotheses about that. And there were also explanations that had to do with certain kinds of food or drink. You can see, for example, in the image that I've given you here from the New York City Board of Health in 1832, preventives of cholera. Here was the advice of the day, published by order of the Sanitary Committee: be temperate in eating and drinking, avoid raw vegetables and unripe fruit, abstain from cold water, and above all from ardent spirits. So, abstaining from cold water might have been the only element here which could have helped people if it was water that wasn't from a pure source. But other than that, we know that the other pieces of advice really had nothing to do with the actual cause of cholera itself. Now, what's interesting is that throughout the 19th century, cholera tended to be associated in the minds of the middle class, sometimes in the minds of the public health authorities, with certain communities. It, as I mentioned before, and we understand now why, it showed up very strongly in working class neighborhoods, which tended to not have good water, not have good sewage, and therefore often people tended to associate cholera with people who were poor, with people who lived in not the most salubrious living conditions. And also, in some cases, if there was prostitution in these neighborhoods, then it was also associated with sexual immorality. In the United States, as you can imagine, it was often African-American neighborhoods or Irish neighborhoods that were most strongly linked in the public imagination with cholera. And in European countries, it varied depending on which country we're talking about. Sometimes it was local Roma or Gypsy populations. Sometimes, as in Russia, it was associated, not all the time, but it could be associated with Jews. Now, there were many, many different popular reactions to cholera, including different kinds of remedies that people tried out because they were desperate for some sort of cure. And it's worth noting, and I'm going to come back to this later on in the talk, that the working classes were very often mistrustful of medical experts. And it's not that surprising, actually, given that up until the end of the 19th century, the medical experts, the public health authorities, really had no more idea of what was causing cholera than the working classes did. So everything was kind of a guess, other than quarantine, which was often carried out with a good deal of violence, or at least with some disregard for for how people live their everyday lives and how it would affect them. So there was a lot of mistrust. There was a lot of resistance across Europe to the steps that public health authorities tried to take. For example, in Britain in 1832, there were riots that were sparked by the idea that there were doctors in cholera hospitals who were using the corpses of people who had died of the disease for medical experimentation. And so there was a kind of a conspiracy theory about the body snatchers. In St. Petersburg, Russia, there were also riots against the police who would often come into homes and take people by force to the cholera hospitals. And it was generally understood that if you were taken to the hospital, you were going to die. It wasn't a place to get better. It was a place where where the mortality rates were actually higher. And so people were very, very wary of the police coming to take the sick by force. So there was a great deal of mistrust in the air about cholera. As I mentioned, nobody really knew what caused it. So there wasn't really any secure way of knowing what would get you out of the disease. So there were many, many quack cures, magical cures that you could find around the world, depending on whatever country you're looking at. In Russia in particular, we know that the magic circle was often used, and this is a popular magical talisman, which you can find in many, many cultures. The idea of drawing a circle around a house or around a neighborhood or a town or even an entire city to try to protect that, that space within the circle from the evil that seems to be threatening it. That, of course, survives to this day. And you can see in this image that I'm showing you here, the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church in April 2020 carried out this religious ritual where he circled the entire city of Moscow in a motorcade with the famous icon. Of course, the patriarch would not have called it magic, but essentially that is what's going on. And there's all kinds of other magical remedies that we can find as well, both among Christians and among Jews. Now, within the Jewish community in particular, there were some remedies that were offered by rabbis or by others in the community. Some of them go back centuries within Jewish tradition and seem perhaps more logical than others. So the idea that everyone should try to give more charity than usual, because if the epidemic was a sign of God's anger, of God's wrath, then perhaps it was because people weren't being charitable enough, people weren't being compassionate enough. So it was important to give more charity, to check the mezuzahs, the amulet which contains scrolls from the Torah, passages from the Torah that's on the doorpost of every Jewish home. There was a widespread assumption that if your mezuzahs were somehow incorrect, or there was a letter missing, that it would be an opening for demons or evil to enter your house. And all kinds of different amulets with variations of God's name, rings made out of palm fronds. There was also another linkage here to sexual immorality, which I mentioned a few minutes ago in the Jewish community as well. Apparently, it was also an understanding that that a case of sexual immorality within a community could give rise to or make the community more susceptible to the disease. And then finally, the cholera wedding, which is, of course, what I'm talking about today. And that's a religious ritual that, as I mentioned, emerges, as far as I can tell, in the early 19th century, and then continues on into the 20th century as well. So the earliest text we have about the cholera wedding seems to suggest that it was two poor orphans, or perhaps just two poor people in the community. And this may actually be connected to the directive that I mentioned a minute ago, the idea that if one gives charity, if one does charitable deeds during a time of epidemic, that it may be able to save the community. And it was well known that if you enabled two poor people to marry, that would be a charitable deed. That would be considered a mitzvah, a good deed in the eyes of God. And the idea that dowering the needy bride, for example, was a great charitable deed goes back millennia in Jewish tradition. So for some reason, and this is what we'll explore for the next few minutes, the ritual emerged in the first cholera pandemic to hit the Russian Empire in the early 1830s of marrying off these two poor people in the cemetery. And I'm stressing in the cemetery because it's very unusual in Jewish tradition to hold a wedding in a cemetery. It's almost unheard of. And so the fact that it would take place in the cemetery is one of the most unusual features of the cholera wedding. Now I want to show you very briefly one of the first pieces of evidence that we have for the cholera wedding. I'm showing you part of the the Hebrew text, and then the English translation. In the year 5591, which corresponds to 1831, there was a cholera epidemic which also came to Rimanov. And they carried out the known remedy of marrying a poor man to a poor maiden in the cemetery. So as you can see, it's very, very terse. There's really not much information here. This, by the way, comes from a book of Hasidic tales, tales and legends about leaders of the Hasidic communities in Eastern Europe. And you can also see that the text refers to the cholera wedding as the known remedy. So in 1894, this editor apparently assumed that that had been going on for some time. I contend that actually this may have been one of the first instances of the cholera wedding, and by the 1890s, they were so familiar with it that they just assumed that it had been going on for much longer than just 6 decades or so. So with the subsequent cholera epidemics, it continues to spread this ritual across the areas of the Russian Empire and other parts of Eastern Europe, including the Polish parts of the Austrian Empire. The difference is that in these later iterations, it seems to be no longer just 2 poor people or 2 poor orphans, but instead, the people who are recruited, as it were, to serve as cholera brides and cholera grooms are recruited from the outcasts of the community. And these are the marginalized people that I discuss in my book that include beggars, vagrants who wandered from town to town, people who had disabilities of various kinds, whether physical disabilities or cognitive disabilities, people who are mentally ill. Sometimes they were called town fools. So these are the people who live metaphorically and sometimes literally at the outskirts of the community itself, on the edge of the community. And they are the ones who are brought in to serve as the cholera brides and cholera grooms, as I mentioned. Sometimes the way the wedding is described, it seems to take on a kind of a carnival atmosphere where people are drinking to excess and there's kind of carousing happening. That doesn't, it's not always the case, but that sometimes happens. And I'd like to suggest that there might be also an element of a kind of a freak show here, because as I mentioned, sometimes the bride and the groom have some physical disabilities, sometimes kind of deformity. And these are people who would generally have been laughed at for much of the rest of the year or poked fun at. We know that from some of the sources, the historical sources that we have about the lives that these people led in either a small community or even a big city. So they had difficult lives. And it's not clear that the cholera wedding was necessarily any easier for them, let's say. They were usually recruited. They were more or less compelled to participate in the ritual. It wasn't something that they necessarily did voluntarily. Now, the cholera wedding spreads to Ottoman Palestine in the 1880s and 1890s, and also to the United States and Canada, as I recently discovered. So we had one taking place in Philadelphia in the early 20th century, also in New York City, apparently in Winnipeg as well. There may be other instances too. And then ultimately, once cholera is no longer a pandemic threat, as it had been before, we see, especially immediately following the World War I, that the ritual reemerges when there's another kind of disease, another kind of epidemic, whether it's typhus or influenza. We don't hear about it for a couple decades, the 20s and the 30s. Generally, we don't hear about the cholera wedding, and then it comes back in a few places during the Holocaust. So that's the kind of biography in a nutshell of the cholera wedding. By the way, it was called in Yiddish, usually Mageife Chasana, which means a plague wedding, sometimes Schwarze Chasana, which means a black wedding, apparently because sometimes they would use a black a canopy, a chuppah, the wedding canopy in the Jewish ceremony, they would make out of black material for that particular kind of wedding in a cemetery. Now, as I mentioned, there is one possible reason, possible explanation for the cholera wedding, which has to do with it being a great charitable deed, and that this was, in a sense, the community as a whole trying to make up for whatever sins it had committed against its marginalized members in earlier years. And generally, communities were pretty aware that they didn't treat these people particularly well. This is another discussion, possibly for the question and answer period, but generally these marginalized people, although they were taken care of in some way or another in the Jewish community, especially in Eastern Europe, was certainly known for its charitable institutions, of which there were many, but at the same time, certainly from the 1840s, 1850s onward, these outcasts were really outcasts, and they tended to be, although not necessarily cast out altogether by the community, the conditions in which they lived were certainly not ones that any of us would have wanted to live in. So the charitable deed is one explanation that was offered by some apologists for the wedding at the time. There were some rabbis who explained that this is what was going on, and that's why it was okay to carry out this kind of ritual. There's some other explanations as well that I go into in some detail in the book. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them right now. One of them has to do with the idea that an orphan's prayer was particularly effective, and this goes back many centuries in the Jewish tradition, back to the Middle Ages. The idea that an orphan, because he or she was somehow more conversant, was better acquainted with death itself, that they could bridge the gap between the living and the dead, between this world and the next world, and somehow their prayer to heaven would be more likely to be received and listened to. And as I mentioned before, often the bride and the groom in this ceremony were orphans themselves. And there's also a long tradition in Judaism of praying in a cemetery during a catastrophe. It's not something that rabbinic authorities usually approved of, because they worried that people were praying for intercession, praying directly to the ancestors, which was forbidden in Judaism. But nonetheless, Jews continued to do this generation after generation. And so the idea of going to the cemetery during a crisis was not at all new. By the way, this image that I'm showing you here is a kind of a memory, apparently. Meir Kirschenblatt, who emigrated from Poland in the early 20th century, later in life, very late in life actually, started to paint series of paintings about his native town, his native Poland. And he included this painting of the Black Wedding, or the cholera wedding, which apparently he did not witness himself, but he had heard about it happening in his town from other people. There's another possible explanation, which is quite suggestive, quite interesting, which goes back to the idea that this was somehow a kind of a carnival experience for people. There was some sort of entertainment value to it. And the way I want to explain this is that for much of the 19th century, and especially in the earlier pandemics, it was understood, there was kind of a basic societal understanding about cholera, that if you were afraid and if you were anxious about the disease, that very anxiety would cause you to be more susceptible to it. And so there are various phenomena that we find across Europe where people seem to be trying to lift up their spirits almost artificially as a way of banishing the fear that could make them more susceptible to cholera. So for example, in Paris, we hear about carnival revelers who are masquerading as cholera victims, which might otherwise seem very inappropriate, I know, unless we understood exactly what it was they had in mind when they were kind of trying to bring joy to each other in this particular way. In Britain, during one of the cholera pandemics, there were songs that were sung, comic songs about cholera. And then we have this explanation for the cholera wedding itself among Jews in Eastern Europe. And here I'm pointing you to a rabbinic work, which is a work that tries to explain Jewish customs that was published in 1890. And the text here goes, and everyone attends the wedding in the cemetery in a celebration of mass joy and music and much happiness, to arouse happiness in the masses so that they not be sad, which is a great danger in this matter. You see, that's, I believe what he's referring to there is this longstanding idea that it is dangerous to be sad, to be despairing during a pandemic, so that they not be afraid and become accustomed to the cemetery and not fear death. So it's a way of lifting people up during a time of great fear, which is something that unfortunately all of us are well acquainted with today in our own circumstances. And the idea, right, and I don't think this is actually so far from what current mental health advice would say to people in the pandemic today. The idea is try to keep your spirits up, right? Not so much because you're going to succumb to the disease or be more vulnerable to it, but in fact we know that it's important to just for your kind of general well-being, including your immune system, to stay positive, and that may be what they're talking about here. I also want to suggest something else about the cholera wedding, since, as I mentioned to you, my essential argument about the genesis of the cholera wedding is that we can date it to the early 19th century, but there may be a literary precedent to the cholera wedding that we find in a Purim spiel, which is a kind of a folk theatrical piece that was very common in the Jewish world on the carnival holiday of Purim. There was a particular Purim spiel that was uncovered by the historian Yitzchak Schipper, who was one of the foremost historians in Poland of Jewish society, including the history of drama and theater in the Jewish world. And one of those Purim spiels is called the Beggar's Farce. And it's basically the engagement ceremony and the wedding of a beggar couple who are obviously being played by Purim players. They're not beggars themselves. And one of the points apparently of this play is to poke fun and really to have a good laugh at the expense of these beggars. And we're going to go through it briefly, just so I can give you a sense of the themes that the outcasts of the Jewish community, and beggars, as I mentioned, were among these categories of marginalized people that I study in my book, the themes that they tended to be associated with. Right? And as I mentioned, of course, this is a wedding. Right? So it's really a cholera wedding avant la lettre, before we actually had such a thing as a cholera wedding. And so the way it goes is, for the engagement ceremony, we have an old grandfather who says to the couple, congratulations. By the way, if you read Yiddish, you can look at the text on the right side of the screen. These are the terms, the tanoim. You are both totally ignorant Jews, goy segoyim. So it starts off right off the bat with insults. Aimed at these beggars. These are the garments. So these are the conditions that you would have in an ordinary Jewish engagement. It would talk about the material basis for the match, nothing at all. So no garments. For a dowry, I give 450 score demons. The association here, very importantly, is with the other world, with the supernatural. Lodging in the poorhouse, which is where beggars usually lived. There was a Jewish poorhouse in almost every town and city in Eastern Europe. Maintenance, how are you going to live? Begging, door to door, of course. A position at the cemetery, because very often beggars were given a place at the cemetery to beg, because people who visited graves often wanted to give charity. And all is valid and binding. And then we come to the wedding. I hereby wed you, you two blemishes. And then we have the traditional words of the Jewish wedding vows here interspersed with more curses. So the Hebrew words here are mostly in italics. Hareyat mekudeshes li batavas ukedas Moshe b'Yisrael. And then you have various curses. On you, my child, the plague, and on the lout too. So plague right here in the middle of the wedding ceremony. Connection to disease, to epidemic. May the lout burn like straw. May you both be bitten by the cat. There begins to be a connection to animals, to the idea that perhaps these outcasts are not entirely human. Yaksabaka, Mekudeshes Yaksabaka Breshish, which is the Ukrainian as the dog lies. You should lie in the poorhouse bed, again, the poorhouse, and you should both swell up like a barrel, which is again a reference to some kind of disease. The last line is particularly important. May you both be punished instead of me and the whole Jewish people. And the word kapore or kapara in Hebrew, that's a word that's shared in Hebrew and Yiddish, is very, very important here because it has a long history in Judaism as a religion, going back to the days of the temple, when part of the Yom Kippur ritual, the ritual for the Day of Atonement, was sending a scapegoat out into the wilderness with symbolically the sins of the people heaped upon its head. And that is the kapara, and that, or the kapora, and that idea persists in many ways in Jewish tradition and in Jewish folklore all the way up to the period that we're talking about here. And the kapora here really refers to as a scapegoat, so someone who is punished instead of everyone else. And that to me is very, very significant, because you have right here in this farce, in this farcical wedding, the idea, apparently very central idea, because it really ends the whole ceremony, that this beggar couple is going to be punished instead of the entire Jewish people. So that is kind of my main claim about the cholera wedding. I think the reason I say it's my main claim is because it's the argument, the explanation for the ritual that connects most easily to the rest of my book, which is obviously all about these marginalized people, all about these outcasts. And we have other instances in Jewish history in Eastern Europe where those outcasts are also seen as some kind of a scapegoat, that they are meant to take upon themselves, or people want to cast upon them any kind of evil that they are experiencing. And this may well connect to a theory I have that Jews in Eastern Europe, who were of course the target of much anti-Semitism and much persecution from the outside, from Russian society, from Russian government, in some cases seem to project those characteristics which they saw as hateful onto these Jewish outcasts. So I'll go through a number of different instances where we see these people being perceived as scapegoats. First of all, the Purim spiel that we just talked about. May you both be punished. We also have the instance, very tragic historical episode of the conscription of Jewish men, and actually boys as well, as young as 10 or 11 years old, under Nicholas I in the early part of the 19th century. In this case, Jewish communities often they were forced by the government to choose who among their midst would be handed over to the army as recruits for a 25-year period, which meant that they would almost certain not to see their family again. And very often they chose from among the marginalized people in the community. And we have a folk song, a Yiddish folk song, that refers to the poor child from a poor family, the child of a widow who's drafted into the army as a scapegoat, as a kapore. And just briefly, I'll show you the words of this folk song, or part of it. Tears flow in the streets. One could wash oneself in children's blood. Skipping down a little bit, they drag little chicks, little boys, obviously, from cheder, from the religious school. They dress them in military uniforms. Our elders, our rabbis, help to force them into military service. Zusharakover has 7 sons. This is The idea here is this is a prosperous man in the community. Not one of them was drafted, but Leah, the widow's only son, is made to pay the price for the Kahal's sins. The Kahal is the organized Jewish community. And the Yiddish here is very important. Leah, the widow's einzige Kind, only son, is a kapore, for kol shezin, is a kapora, the same word that we saw before. He's a scapegoat for the treachery, for the sins of the Kahal. He is made to bear the brunt of this evil decree, which has fallen upon the entire Jewish community. And so there's other instances of the bride and groom or the outcasts being perceived as scapegoats, which I won't go into right now. But ultimately, what I'm arguing is that they function symbolically as substitute victims, as surrogates for the entire epidemic as a whole, and that may be how the cholera wedding functions in people's minds. Obviously from an anthropological perspective, we're trying to understand how does this ritual actually work. And for me, as I mentioned before, this connects to the themes of the book as a whole. This is a really excellent example of how these outcasts in the Jewish community come to serve as a surrogate, as a symbol, as a kind of icon for all of East European Jewry. And here's a quote from the introduction to my book, which basically sums it up. They served as a kind of doppelganger onto which the mainstream of Jewish society could project its own fears and anxieties about Jews and their place in the modern world. And as I mentioned earlier, this had a lot to do with self-loathing, with the impact of anti-Semitism on Jews, and the question of how do we see ourselves in this world, and how do others see us, right? What's the image that we want to put forward to people? I like this particular illustration of a cholera wedding right here that I'm showing you by an artist by the name of David Becker, who immigrated to the United States from Eastern Europe in the early 20th century, because to me, at least, it captures the fear and the uncertainty and the apprehension in the faces of the bride and the groom, for whom this is presumably not a particularly happy day, since they are, as I mentioned before, usually forced to marry each other. This is not of their own choosing, and often they're going to continue, the wedding itself will continue a cycle of marginalization, which had existed beforehand as well. Now, the conclusion of my book, and really of this lecture, has to do with the transformation of the marginal figure at the turn of the 20th century and into the early decades of the 20th century, all the way into the 1920s and the 1930s, where, especially because of changing political currents with the rise of Jewish nationalism, in other words, Zionism, and other forms of Jewish nationalism, as well as Jewish socialism, and other modern ideas, this Jewish outcast becomes or begins to be transformed into a much more sympathetic figure, especially because when you have political movements that are trying to transform the Jewish people, trying to lift it up from something that's lowly and vulnerable and cast out, there's no better symbol for that circumstance than the Jewish outcast. So we see very often in political works and in literary writings and in film. So this is, of course, in starting in the 20s and the 30s, you begin to have the marginal figure be a sympathetic protagonist for the first time. And as I'm trying to say, that's something that's quite new. And again, as I mentioned before, they're serving as a kind of symbol for the Jewish people as a whole, for the weakness, for the vulnerability of the Jewish people, but also for its potential to be transformed into something entirely new. And so what I'm showing you here on the screen, and what I'll show you a few minutes of as well in a second, is an image from The Light Ahead, which was an adaptation of a famous Yiddish novel that was written in the late 19th century by Mendele Mocher Sforim, by a very famous Yiddish writer. As you can see here, the actors who played the lead characters in this film, you have Fischke der Krummer, Fischke the lame on the left, so he is known as the cripple, and you have Hodel on the right, who is blind. So they both have physical disabilities, and ordinarily in the old ways, they would have been the outcasts of the community. But in this film, they are, as you can see, first of all, portrayed by beautiful actors, right? You can't take your eyes off of them, as is true in the movie itself. And they also end up having the last laugh on the other townspeople and on the leadership of their Jewish community, which tries to make them serve as cholera bride and cholera groom, which they eventually do. Only the community doesn't realize that Hodel and Fischke are actually in love with each other already. So that's one of the ways in which they have the last laugh on the community. And then there's another way as well, which I'm going to try to show you right now, if I can just call up the correct tab on my computer and show you a very short clip, two short clips from this particular film called The Light Ahead, or Fischke der Krummer. No, that's not it. Give me one more second. What are you seeing now? Are you seeing?
Waiting for it to come up.
You're waiting, okay. So for some reason, I'm having trouble sharing it. Let's see if I can do it this time. Let me try one more time.
If there's audio, please make sure to check the box, the bottom
Yes,
box of the share screen.
that's checked.
Okay, gotcha.
Can you see it now?
I do see it, yes.
Okay.
In der Ritter Fischke hat Stutt beschlossen. Wir machen der Chassene mit Halate-Schiedisch Mädel. Wir stellen der Chippe auf den Besäulem. In Beschisse wird uns Gott helfen, in stillen Sandsorgen.
Aber als man will nicht Chassen auf dem Besäulem, sie zwischen alle Mäßen?
Es wird dir gut nicht helfen, Fischke. Stutt hat so beschlossen.
Was heißt, Stutt hat beschlossen? Mich hat er nicht gefragt.
Nun fragen wir doch jetzt.
Mein Answer ist... Nein.
Was wird der Hagen nachher? Die Stutt wird dir geben, a schönem Nagen, Chassene Matunes, a latische jüdische Tochter. Wo sie sich herindrehen, a Bucher glatter Zoi. Wo sie ist, a Tachles, Zug allein, Fischke?
Wer ist das Mädel?
Na, aber zu dem hat er Segel. Warte hat er Segel. Wer das Mädel ist, fragst du?
Ja, wer?
Die blinde Isäume Hudele.
Hudele?
Mhm.
Tome wird sie nicht wählen?
Wo sie wird nicht wählen.
Tome wird sie suchen, als sie will nicht, sie will nicht.
Ich will nicht. Hudele. Es ist doch eine sehr große Mitzwe. Und auch der Ziffer der ganzen Stut. Wie also kannst du sich auf viele Hufe suchen. Lasst mich ab. Lasst mich ab. Was hat ihr so umgesetzt durch meine Jugend? Ich bin schon eine lernende Säume. Darf mir schon verzocken, mein Blätt?
Ich habe gemeint verkehrt, sie wird bei dir zusammengelegt, wo die Stut will dir zudecken den Kopf.
Aber warum bin ich ärger von alle anderen jüdischen Töchter? Warum kommt mir rund in eine Sache? Was habe ich sollen? Ich hasse nur machen auf den Besäulen. Ich habe Meir.
Du darfst nicht gemäuer haben. Ich will dir aufsprechen und Gott wird dir helfen, zusammen mit Masel, mit Beruche. Und du kriegst doch schöne Katzen und Matunen.
Was zeigen mir die Matunen, was mit dem Stern der Kippe war so schrecklich auf? Nachher Leben, wenn ihr folgt mir, was ihr gelassen sind, die Menschen allein in Verführung.
Allein gut. Macht es zusammen. Kim's Wasser.
Aber nein, gehst du vor?
Wie soll es nicht sein? Hast du Stutt will noch machen von der Cholerie kann? Und ich von Cholerie husten.
Ein anderer Breder haben wir. Als wir seine Wiestor in der Leid.
Alle wollen teilen mit den guten Finger. Und als wir wollen haben Kinder. Und mit sie reden die Cholerie Kinder.
Das tag ich dir recht, Hudele. Oder teire. Ob nicht jetzt, wenn sie denn.
And here's the wedding scene.
Nu, Fischgeliebe, Nudelteire, unsere Wegen zu schäden sich hat er. Hat Kinder hat mit dem Weg von dem Kirche. In solchen der dosiger Weg auch führen, nicht zu der schändlicher Neut in bitterer Ruhe geht. Noch ein Tag ja bis ein Normalleben, viel mit Freude, mit Schiebes.
Hat danke, Red Mendele. A Jona fremder Stutt wird schon keiner nicht halten müssen mit den Fingern und sagen, und geht doch Cholerie Chusmen, und geht doch Cholerie Kalle.
Nein, Nudelteil. Fischke, dein Nudel ist gewinn gerecht, wenn sie gewollt weg von Asach tut. Was lebt noch also wie im Mittelalter, was meinen, als mit Aberglauben, wenn sie Putter wären von der Cholerie.
Ja, danke. Ein größten Dank, euch, Red Mendele. Ihr seid gewesen wie ein eigener Tattezins. Ein größten Dank.
Red Mendele. Ich sehe ja, ihr geht hart.
Ja, Kind. Die sehst, die bist nicht blind, weil du bist glücklich. Nur Kinder, geht gesinnter Red. Soll euch Gott helfen, wir sollen schon mehr nicht wissen von Kindern.
So as you can see there, Fishka and Hodel have the last laugh because they escape from the village. What happens during the wedding is that they just vamoose and nobody can find them. And they're escaping. They're escaping from that, from what's imagined in the film as a realm of darkness, of superstition, to some brighter shore, whether it's a land of Israel or the United States. It's unclear, but they're going someplace where they won't have to live in such medieval conditions as their kind helper tells them in the last few minutes that you saw there of the film. And in terms of moral character, it's really the outcasts who are the ones that we look at as our heroes in this story, and the so-called leaders of the community are the ones who are really morally vile. I'm going to skip over that one source for now and go to this last slide. So when I wrote my book, I had thought that the last time we would ever see the cholera wedding, the plague wedding, as a real phenomenon in society would be, as I mentioned, during the Holocaust, when there were those last episodes, the last instances of the plague wedding. But as it turns out, it was recently revived in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood or ultra-Orthodox city of Bnei Brak in Israel. In March, there was a wedding of 2 orphans in a cemetery as an attempt to stop the COVID-19 epidemic. I don't know much about this wedding yet. I haven't managed to find out very much about it other than what was printed in some Israeli newspapers at the time. One of the religious newspapers that described the phenomenon, that described the ritual and tried to explain why it was being carried out from kind of a historical perspective, seemed to get a lot of that history wrong. So it's unclear to me exactly what the people who were carrying out the wedding, what they perceived as the genealogy of that ritual, but generally it was presented as something that was a great charitable deed. This goes back to the explanation that I was mentioning earlier, the kind of apologetic explanation, which is that it's a great charitable deed to marry off 2 people who otherwise would have a very hard time getting married. Why it happens exactly in a cemetery was not explained at the time, but you can see that there is indeed a black wedding canopy, which would not normally be the color of the chuppah at a Jewish ceremony. So this is the trajectory of the cholera wedding. Apparently, one of the reasons I think it has persisted all the way up until the 21st century is because of its incredible power as a ritual. I think that there's many, as I've pointed out, many different explanations for the ritual itself, and I don't think I've exhausted them all in my book or in this talk. But my goal was to try to give you a sense of this very unusual ritual and also what it can tell us about how a society treats its most vulnerable at a time of catastrophe, which unfortunately we know all too well today in our own society as well. And I'll be happy to talk more about that during the question and answer period too. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Natan, for a fascinating talk and for providing us for a really deep insight into issues around public health, from tensions around modernization and tradition and inventive societal responses to an epidemic in the Russian Empire in the 19th century, and some responses that might to some degree resonate today. So before I have a number of questions that I received during the talk, and some very good questions, but I want to start with the question that since you ended with this reemergence of the ritual during the corona pandemic, it makes me wonder a little bit about how the knowledge of this special ritual was transmitted in the Jewish community, within the Jewish community. Was it through oral history or written accounts? And I think you just said that you weren't sure about the genealogy exactly of this particular ritual that happened right now in Bnei Brak in Israel. But I'm wondering where this sort of tradition resided in all these, right, this sort of decades that where it didn't take place. And the other question I had is whether is there any documentation of this ritual among Sephardi communities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great questions. You know, my my instinct tells me, because we don't know for sure the answer to the first question, we don't know exactly how the knowledge got transmitted, but my instinct tells me that it kind of resided in the collective store of knowledge of opsprechers, which are the women that you saw in the film, or at least that's a representation of that kind of woman, who were basically the Jewish women who were ritual experts, who knew magic, who knew Jewish folk rituals, and who knew Jewish magic. And they were often the ones who are described in the narratives that tell us about the Collar wedding. They're the ones who initiate it very often. And so I think that the fact that the film shows this particular woman as being the one behind the Collar wedding, I think that actually is probably, there's some historical truth to that. And this is research that I'm actually still doing right now, because this whole episode with the Collar wedding kind of ignited my interest in Jewish magic. And so I'm doing some research now on who these women were and how they might have the exact question you're asking really is how they transmitted their knowledge from generation. And it was basically, my understanding is that it was oral, right? It was orally. It was passed down from one generation to the next. And therefore there was often opposition from rabbinical authorities, because they had disapproved of magic and of these kind of superstitions, but they were very popular among the Jewish masses. That was certainly true, and it's very easy to understand how that could have happened in the kind of organic traditional environment of Eastern Europe, especially in a shtetl, let's say a market town with a Jewish majority, where there's Jewish life continues traditionally in some form or another for into the 20th century. We also know that, of course, there were cholera weddings in big cities, and there were cholera weddings. Actually, one of the ones that I mentioned during the Holocaust took place in an area that had been Soviet during the 1920s and 1930s, when there was not very much Jewish transmission at all, or it was very limited during that period. And yet here we are in 1941 or 42, when Jews in that town say, hey, we remember there was this thing called the cholera wedding. So in some cases, it may have been more of a historical memory. And my sense with the COVID-19 wedding that happened earlier this year is that it was most likely understood, it was remembered out of something that was written down, rather than having been passed down from generation to generation, because those kind of Jewish women ritual experts, for the most part, don't exist anymore, at least not in that ultra-Orthodox community. So I think there's probably a number of different ways that we could try to understand the knowledge being passed on from generation to generation. As far as Sephardic communities, I have not found any yet. My understanding is that the weddings that were conducted in Ottoman Palestine were among the Ashkenazic community, and so that there's still no kind of crossover there to anything any community outside of the Ashkenazic world, because essentially that community was almost a cultural and religious extension of the Jews in Eastern Europe, or at least for the most part. So no, I have not yet found a parallel. I've searched through Jewish folklore, and I've certainly not limited myself to Eastern European Jewish folklore, because as you did, I thought maybe there's some parallel to it in other Jewish communities, but so far I haven't found. But I wouldn't be surprised, if it does appear somewhere.
Thank you. Very interesting. So I have some questions from the audience, and start here. Let's see. Okay. So I have a question from Sophie about how often do these magical practices like the cholera wedding occur in tandem with medical scientific strategies? For instance, with the advent of germ theory or during the 1918 influenza epidemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because that's something that I sometimes get to in the talk and sometimes I don't. This time I didn't. And in fact, I kind of suggested earlier in the talk, early on, that I would relate to it later on, and I didn't. So this is a good opportunity to come back to it. So the larger answer to the question is that there seems to be, excuse me, this is a little helium balloon from a birthday party earlier today. There seems to be no real relationship between the two. In other words, even when you have the beginning of germ theory that becomes widely understood and people know that there's a scientific basis to these diseases, whether it's cholera or any other disease, that doesn't seem to matter, because when, as I mentioned before, when you have typhus epidemics or the influenza epidemic of 1919, we still find cholera weddings taking place. So there's seems to be something very, very deep there. But there's something else I want to say about that, which is that there may be actually a kind of causal connection there. And what I mean by that is that the cholera wedding, although it is relatively new, as I mentioned, I think it only emerged in the early 19th century, but I think the sense generally among Jews is that it has a very old lineage. So it's a kind of, it's rooted in tradition. And the way that you respond, right, especially according to these ritual experts, the way that you respond to these innovative or kind of newfangled medical techniques that are being brought to your community from the outside, either by the government, who Jews did not trust in Eastern Europe for obvious reasons, because it would generally tended to persecute them, or at the very least was not particularly nice to them, or from Jewish medical experts who often were associated in the popular imagination with heresy, with people who did not observe all of the commandments and who were impious in some way or another. So for Jewish traditionalists, medical expertise could often be associated with negative ideas from the outside, with negative tendencies, just as was true for many of the working classes across Europe, who I discussed earlier in the lecture, who were very distrustful of the authorities, including public health authorities. So in this way, the cholera wedding was kind of a way of thumbing your nose at all those experts and saying, no, we don't trust you. We don't want to have anything to do with all that medical advice. We'll take the old-fashioned religion, and the old-fashioned religion is the cholera wedding, because that really represents the tried and true technique, the kind of the traditional Jewish ideas of charity and of the wedding, which is of course a very central Jewish life cycle ritual. So for rabbis, it was often, for rabbis and kind of Jewish intellectuals, the cholera wedding was a nightmare, because it seemed to represent all that was medieval about Judaism or superstitious that they wanted to get rid of. But for many ordinary Jews, it was everything that they were looking for in a ritual.
Fascinating. And I have somewhat of a follow-up question to the previous question from Irina Levizianu, who is the Director of Jewish Studies at the University of Pittsburgh, and co-sponsor of the talk. And she asks whether the cholera wedding was limited to the Russian Empire, or was it practiced among other Ashkenazi communities west of there in Austria-Hungary and among Romanian Jews, for example?
Great question. Irina, thank you, first of all, for co-sponsoring. I'm pleased that you were able to ask that question, which is a really important one. It was not limited to the Russian Empire. In fact, it may be that the first instances of the cholera wedding actually appear in Galicia, which is the southern part of Poland, which at that time was ruled by the Austrian Empire. So we have instances of the cholera wedding that take place in the region of Galicia, also across the border in the Pale of Settlement, which is of course ruled by Russia, as well as in the Kingdom of Poland, which was the kind of rump part of Poland that was ruled over by the Russian Empire. Now, I have not heard of any cholera weddings in Romania. I also have not heard of cholera weddings in Hungary, or really anywhere west of Poland. And then beyond that, there's what I mentioned before, which is the Ottoman Palestine, so the land of Israel in the late 19th century, and then North America eventually as well. Now, why we would see cholera weddings taking place in areas of target areas of Jewish migration from Eastern Europe, like North America, but not in Western Europe, where Jews were also immigrating to, that I'm not sure about. And I suspect, I gave a talk to a UK audience last week, and they were asking if there were any episodes of a cholera wedding in the UK. I haven't found any, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone did come upon one at some point. I suspect that perhaps there were elements in the Jewish community that would have been, I mean, I don't suspect, I know that there were elements in the Jewish community that were ashamed of episodes like the cholera wedding and would have wanted to keep it quiet, but there was a kind of a parallel tendency within the Jewish community, especially in the educated elements of the Jewish community, to make it known so that you could kind of bring the cancer to the light of day, as it were, or air your dirty laundry and say, look, this is a horrible thing. We should never allow this to happen. And of course, it sold newspapers because it was interesting, and if you wrote an article about it, it would usually sell. So that's what you see in the Jewish press in Philadelphia and New York, where you have articles being written about it and saying, isn't this awful? And then they have a long description of it, which is, of course, it's kind of funny, but logical at the same time. So yeah, that's as much as I know right now, although like I said, I think we might uncover more evidence of the cholera wedding. I didn't search for it specifically in Western Europe, or for example in Hungary, so it could be that it's there and I just didn't uncover it, or others have not thought to uncover it yet. Although I also know that previous scholars, I'm talking about scholars who, let's say in the 1920s or the 1930s, researched the cholera wedding at that time, they only wrote about it as being an Eastern European phenomenon. They never talked about any other part of Europe. So I'm assuming that it did not happen at that anywhere else.
Thank you, Natan. So I'm going to move on to some other questions. We have a question from Artemis. How did Jewish communities who performed cholera weddings ever question the wedding's success in fighting the pandemic? Which is very interesting.
Yeah. Well, it depends who you mean by community when you ask that question, because I think, as I mentioned before, that there were certainly elements in the Jewish community that from the very beginning questioned the idea of the cholera wedding. And these are usually, if there's Jewish intellectuals or progressives, we would call them maskilim, or proponents of the Jewish Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment in the late 19th century. And they were very, very outspoken in their opposition. And sometimes, as I mentioned, there were local rabbis as well who were opposed to the cholera wedding too. And that's actually, interestingly enough, that was usually in the earlier periods. And then later on, we hear generally of rabbis supporting the wedding, or even carrying it out themselves, even serving as the person who's actually officiating at the wedding. So it seems that there was a kind of co-opting of the religious authority, and gradually it became normative. And generally, it's hard to say whether or not it was successful. I mean, usually the cholera wedding was only carried out as a kind of a last measure, which means that the epidemic had probably already had torn through a particular community. And therefore, you could be pretty sure that soon after the cholera wedding, it would kind of naturally go away, because at some point the epidemic kind of left the town, as it were. It had done its terrible terrible business. So people, as far as I know, did not, I mean, ordinary folks in Jewish towns and cities generally did not question it. I think if we were able to do a sociological study of a particular Jewish community, we would probably find that there were the strong proponents of the cholera wedding, that there were probably a few people who were opposed to it. And then there were the people in between who were like, let's give it a try. It couldn't hurt, right? And they would come along to the wedding because it was interesting and it was kind of an entertainment. And they would hope that, who knows? I mean, let's give it a try, right? Even we know these days we're in the 21st century, and there's still people who are flogging quack cures on TV. That plenty of people believe in. So a lot of people said at the time, I'm sure they said, let's try it. It couldn't hurt. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why it persisted into the 20th century, when people in theory knew that scientifically there was no way that it could work, but the idea was, well, why not try it?
Turn my mic back on. Okay. Interesting. Another question from Marietta, which is interesting. And she says she wonders about the social hygiene dimension of the cholera wedding, and if the wedding is a way of modeling correct social behavior. So in a sense, the flip side of scapegoating.
Well, yes, I think, right. I think I understand what you're saying. And I think one of what's something I didn't discuss in my talk, but I do talk about it in the chapter in the book about the cholera wedding, which is that anthropologically speaking, the cholera wedding tries to take people who are outside the Jewish community and who are in some ways outside of the norm, whether it's because of their mental state or their physical appearance or the fact that they're not married, right? Because many of these people did not marry at all during their lifetime, which is very unusual in the traditional Jewish community. So the idea of having someone who was in their 30s and 40s and not married was actually also very much outside the mainstream. And so what the cholera wedding did was that it brought them back into the mainstream. It centered them literally at the center of the community because everyone is gathering around them. And it made them normal in a certain way because it married them to each other, right? So in theory, now they look like everyone else because no longer are they outside the realm of what's acceptable. And there's a sexual element here too, which goes back to the sexual issues that I talked about earlier in the talk, which were often connected to the question of why has the cholera come to our town. There's this idea that if people are not married after their early 20s, then sexually they're suspect, right? Because the only way you can have normative acceptable sexual relations in the Jewish community of this kind is within marriage. So when you bring them together in that way, you make them normal again. Although, as I also suggested earlier, they were not made normal again because they were still the wedding perpetuated the cycle of marginality, because to the extent that we ever hear about what happened to this couple after the wedding, and we don't usually hear about them, but in the few cases we do, we hear they continued begging, only they were begging as a couple and not begging separately, and their children were beggars. And sometimes they lived in the poorhouse together. So there's a sense in which it doesn't really make them normal at all. And it kind of a charade on the part of the Jewish community that you are actually normalizing these people. But on the level of symbols, right? So again, from an anthropological perspective, you're taking these liminal people who live on the outskirts of the Jewish community, bringing them to a liminal place, which is the cemetery. And somehow or other, all this liminality put together is going to erase the liminality and make them normal again, which is not really successful.
So that in many ways answers, there's a question from Oriana, who happens to be a student, who asks whether the couple that are being married gain as what do they gain as a unit when they're already so ostracized? So anyhow, so
yeah, that's kind of the same answer. Yeah,
exactly. Let me see what else we have here. Okay. There are a bunch of questions. A question from Ethan, and I believe from Jonathan as well, about this sort of suspicion of medical authorities today among ultra-Orthodox communities, whether during the COVID pandemic, it's something you see, you can talk about it as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I do think that there is a connection there. Not necessarily the connection that there is a kind of direct through line from traditional Jewish communities in Eastern Europe in the 19th century to ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities today, because those communities, although they may look similar, they actually don't have that much in common in terms of their own consciousness of what Judaism is, what Jewish community is, how it interacts with the outside world. But I think there is, in terms of the insularity, I think that is the connection, a very important connection, a very important common denominator, that when you have a community that lives mostly within its own metaphorical four walls and that doesn't like to interact with the outside world very much or tries to minimize those contacts, then I think the mistrust is going to be there probably from the outset. Having said that, if we think about what's been going on in our country for the past 6 months, it certainly isn't only the ultra-Orthodox Jews who are mistrustful of medical authority. I mean, we've got people all over this country who are not, who don't trust the public health authorities. So, you know, and they're not living in insular lives. I mean, maybe they're living in the echo chamber of right-wing media, but many of us live in echo chambers, whether it's right-wing or left-wing. So, you know, it's that doesn't really provide the explanation there. So it's probably, you know, something more complicated. Yes, there is the issue of being insular and the lack of trust of public health authorities. Don't forget, of course, that the ultra-Orthodox world, the authorities that people trust first and foremost are the rabbinic authorities. So if rabbis, and this has been proven true in Israel and also in the United States for that matter, if their rabbis tell them to follow certain public health guidelines, then they will almost certainly do that. But that's a very complicated dance between, you know, that they have to follow between the question of our world and the outside world. And if we follow too many of the directives from the outside world, are we being disloyal to our own community? And I think maybe what the difference here is, that I'm trying to get at, is that there's a difference between politicization of public health authorities, which is what has happened in our country on the one hand. And then there's the question of insularity and the lack of trust of any other authorities outside of your own religious authorities. And those are kind of two separate, they're linked, but I think they're separate.
That's very interesting, because I think since you brought up the example of people in this country who are not ultra-Orthodox being very suspect of public health authorities, I would say it's, you know, probably of government in general. And that's, and that does make it different than these examples of ultra-Orthodox communities where it's also about, right, which authority they're listening to. Maybe there's some of the government, right, suspicion of government as well. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that is a big piece of it. And there maybe that is a common denominator, because the ultra-Orthodox world tends generally not to trust government. You know, it tends to be very, very mistrustful unless it knows that it has some sort of special connection to someone in government. It tends to operate on the same principle of shtadlanut, or of kind of traditional appeals to the authorities, traditional. I'm not remembering what the English terminology for shtadlanut is. Maybe you can help me out, Michal, with that.
Well, it's not lobbying, but
yeah, kind of lobbying is part of it as well, right? So it's the idea of kind of traditionally lobbying or appealing to the authorities, as opposed to the more contemporary political processes that we'd be familiar with today. And so, yeah, in both cases, people are saying we don't trust government generally. So why should we trust what the public health authorities tell us? And that becomes a serious problem when you have a pandemic. And I think in that way, we do have a through line from the 19th century to today, unfortunately.
And it's interesting because there's a documentary, if you recall it, Natan showed an image from this wedding in the cemetery from the city of Bnei Brak, which is right in Israel, near Tel Aviv. And there's a documentary that was made just this summer, I believe, about the handling of the pandemic in the community. And it shows exactly what Natan was telling us, that the Israeli sort of government authorities were working with the rabbis to basically take control of the pandemic in Bnei Brak. And they kept telling the authorities, they're going to listen to the rabbis. They're not going to listen to you. They're going to listen to the rabbis. And that's what ultimately seemed to have helped at that point. So they actually show the rabbis basically assuming this public health role. So, which was very interesting. Mm-hmm. Again, the right. Film, yeah, the film was, again, also meant to show, I'm a little bit, I have mixed feelings about that film, because I think in some part it meant to show the success of the Israeli government's dealing in the early stages with the pandemic. So, but it was an interesting negotiation between these religious authorities and secular public authorities. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have a few more minutes, and I think, let me just see, I think there are some more questions. Oh, there's an interesting question from Alan, whether don't think I asked this one yet, whether were the cholera wedding participants thought to be causing the epidemic intentionally or unintentionally?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't go that far in my argument anywhere, in the book or in my talk to say that the community actually suspected them of causing the epidemic. Obviously, the question of them being a scapegoat is somewhat connected to that. And it's certainly also true, as I said much earlier in my talk, that there were instances when Jews in Europe generally, of course, this goes back to the Middle Ages, to the Black Death, and also in Russia in particular, were blamed for or linked with epidemic in some way or another. And even if the Jews weren't accused of causing it, there were some insinuations that because Jews lived in very dense populations, very dense settlements, that those conditions allowed the epidemic to rip through those communities in a way that it wouldn't necessarily have elsewhere. And there is a little bit of truth to that. But that's kind of as far as it goes. I have no evidence from any of my historical sources that the Jewish communities actually blamed these outcasts for the epidemic. I mean, they would have no basis for doing so, really. And instead, there's this question of kind of symbolically moving the epidemic from the bulk of the community to the scapegoats, and hoping that the evil then kind of disappeared in that way.
Thank you. And it just makes me think of another question with the plague. Non-Jews often saw Jews as both sort of immune from the disease, but also as causing the disease.
Vectors, yeah.
As vectors. Anyhow, that reminded me of that.
Yeah, but that of course goes to the inner contradictions at the heart of anti-Semitism, right? Which never fails to accuse the Jews of both one thing and its converse at the same time without blushing at all.
Exactly. And let me just see. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. And let's see. I think I've asked. Actually, okay. So we do have time for. Irina has another question for you about what kind of sources you use.
Oh yes, I love that question.
Yeah.
So as you can see from some of the sources that I presented to you in the talk, I use as many sources as I can get my hands on, basically, because the history of these marginalized people is so fragmentary that you have to go wherever you can to get your information. So I use kind of traditional Jewish rabbinic sources, as I used in the talk. So Hasidic sources or rabbinic works of various kinds. Literary sources in Hebrew, Yiddish, Russian, Polish. Memoirs are very important. Newspaper sources, so the press at the time, which was also, multilingual. We're talking about the Jewish press and also the general press in the Russian Empire and in Poland. And governmental documents too, archival documents that I found in the archives in the former Soviet Union and elsewhere, that have to do with various aspects of the workings of the Jewish community or the Jewish community's connection to the Russian authorities. I found a really fascinating trove of petitions from ordinary Jews to a wonder worker rabbi that were mostly sent in the 1870s. And there are thousands of those petitions that are located both at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York and at the National Library in Jerusalem. And those petitions are basically tiny little, like this size, Hebrew language petitions for the most part, asking for blessings or for remedies for healing from this rabbi. And people describe their problems in very, very graphic detail. There's no mention of the cholera wedding as far as I could tell in the many documents that I looked at, but there is some connection to the outcasts of the Jewish community, which I talk about in the book. So basically, I just used as many different sources as I possibly could, also including film, as you saw. as you saw earlier. And that was one of the fun things about this project was that, I mean, it was also very challenging, but it was fun to be able to use as many of those different kinds of historical sources as I could.
Thank you very much, Natan. I see we ran out of time already. So if anyone wants to stick around for a second or two, we can sort of spend a few more minutes with you. But otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. And I was very happy to see that their students, colleagues, former colleagues, emeritus, the former head of our department, also joined, who's a public health historian of public health, is here, and community members. So again, it's really, it's been a pleasure, Natan, to host you, and I'm very glad that everyone was able to learn from Natan this evening.
Thank you. Can I say two more things quickly, Michal, if I might? One is that I just put in the chat because I have to push my book, right? That's what I got to do. So the link to my book is in the chat, and you can get 20% off at Stanford University Press if you use that code that I put there, which is Meir20. And also the film that I showed is from the collection of the National Center for Jewish Film, which is based in Brandeis. So if anybody's interested in Yiddish film, I highly recommend you go to their website. They have basically all or most of the Yiddish films that were produced in the early part of the 20th century, National Center for Jewish Film. And thank you both, by the way, so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
And Nico, I don't know if you want to say anything.
I just want to thank you again, Natan. This has been such a rich and provocative conversation. I've learned so much from listening to the way you answered the questions as well as to the presentation itself. And I'd like to thank you. I'd also like to thank you, Michal, for organizing this event and all of the events that you've organized as the Buncher Chair. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I'm very grateful for you putting this together.
Thank you, Nico. And I'll just tell Natan that this semester, I don't know if I remember if I told you or not, but Nico is teaching a course on COVID and history.
Yes, that sounds fascinating.
A micro course, yeah. So, so students will be listening to your lecture as well. Okay, thank you.
I've been delighted to see many of them engaged. So I look forward to hearing from them and seeing all, following up with their questions as well.
Okay, thank you and good night, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks, Natan.